My name is Matt Andrews. I'm going to be speaking this morning with my colleague Lant Pritchett. We work together in a group at the Center for International Development, which is called Building State Capability. Our other partner in crime is Michael Wilcock, who is at the back of the room. I think Michael wants to watch us today and sit and snicker. But we've been working for a while on some questions about how do you build governments in developing countries. And we have, I guess, an observation, an explanation, and then what we think is a very good idea. The observation is that many of the efforts to build governments in developing countries just haven't kind of worked. And it's not to say that they've been complete failures, because that isn't true either. It's just that they've had limited success. We're going to give you some examples of that in a little bit, but a couple that I'll tell you at the moment, and I'll to kind of whet your appetite in understanding where we got to, is there is a group called Global Integrity in Washington, D.C. that analyzes the quality of anti-corruption laws in the world. And they assessed out of 100 what countries' laws look like. And one country in the world got a 99.4 score, the highest in the world. Would anybody know who that is? Venture a guess.
US.
US, absolutely not. No. The US doesn't pretend. Iran, no.
Saudi.
Norway, no.
Nigeria.
It isn't Nigeria, but it is Uganda. Uganda has the best anti-corruption laws in the world. And the thing is that Global Integrity also assesses the implementation of the laws, and Uganda scores 48. So it has the best laws and the biggest gap between laws and reality. Now, we've looked at exactly this thing and found that it pertains to public financial management systems. It pertains to education. It pertains to things like running post offices. It pertains to things like collecting revenue. You have in Africa now, you have revenue agencies that look better than the IRS, which may not be a difficult thing, but that literally don't collect any money. So, it becomes really interesting to say, well, how is it that over 30 years and billions of dollars of reforms in these countries, we have governments that look the part but just don't play the part? That's our first observation. Our explanation, which Lant is going to get to in a little while, in which we're going to kind of have a little exercise with you in the first one, for the first 20 minutes to try and show, is that the way in which we've been doing things doesn't fit the challenge that we are actually engaged with. So there's a way in which you deal with certain problems that can be effective with that, and then there's a way in which you need to deal with other problems that's effective in doing that. And if you use way one with problem two, you're not going to have any impact. And we argue that that's a key part of the issue here. The big idea is something we call PDIA. And Lant and I both worked for the World Bank, so we have to have an acronym. And PDIA basically stands for Problem-Driven Iterative Adaptation. And this is something that we are working with now, doing some experiments around the world. It's a new way of doing reform in governments, where you start from where they are, you identify the problems that they're dealing with, and you iteratively push into the problem, learning about what happens as you move along the way, taking that learning back into a second iteration, and gradually finding and fitting solutions that work to make them more functional, regardless of what they end up looking like. Now, for a lot of people, they say, that kind of sounds like common sense. And we say, well, it is common sense, but what do they say about common sense? It's the least common of the senses. So you have some academics whose research is about trying to apply common sense and show that common sense should be more common. Now, let's start with an exercise. What I'd like you to do is look at the form in front of you, and it's called Getting to Change. I'd like you to work with 2 or 3 people around you, and you have something in front of you that says there's information for you, there's a map, and there's a table of distances between points. I'd like you to pretend that you are in St. Louis, Missouri, and you need to get to Los Angeles. And what I'd like you to do is, with 2 or 3 or 4 people around you, I'd like to give you 4 or 5 minutes where you work out exactly how you're going to get to St. Louis, Missouri, and you can tell me how long it's going to take you. In a car, that's what you have. You can't jump on an airplane. Some people say, "Can I put the car on the airplane?" No, I want you to use the car, and that's how you're going to get to Los Angeles. Is that fair for everyone? So we'll take maybe, let's say if we can do 3 or 4 minutes.
We can't use anything but this.
You can't use anything but that. Okay, use what you have there.
Exactly. You know where I was
We have not the same
Unless you want to group with that.
Doesn't matter. I guess there's two. Yeah, sure. That's fine.
So basically, we have every series.
You guys are.
Shortest possible times, and then we line up.
I'm pretty sure that this is not the right answer.
There's one radical on those.
We can take the number 70,
Oh, we have more.
or that way, yeah. We can take number 40, 44, then 40, and then... Sounds good to me. No, but then you also have to find the route number. What roads will you take? What cities will you pass through? So we know the route we're taking. How long do you think it's going to take, and what stops should we stop? We should go...
Going on average.
So taking the 44, then we go to Oklahoma City.
So we're starting from St. Louis.
Yeah, and we go to Oklahoma City. So that would be 406 miles.
40 hours.
They're all
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Okay, so what I need to
40 hours.
And then we change it to like the That we don't know. We'll have to
Oh,
calculate.
right, exactly. Yeah.
And then from Albuquerque, we can go to
Directly?
Yeah, that's the same 44.
Okay, yeah, okay.
That's the same 40.
40?
Yeah. So they change it Albuquerque,
Yeah.
and then from Albuquerque, and
So what was the first highway we took?
the first time was Highway 44.
44.
And then Oklahoma City is
Okay, Albuquerque. Oh, Oklahoma City?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry. I thought you said Albuquerque. Yeah, I know what you mean. Okay, to Oklahoma City. And then Albuquerque and LA is the same, yeah.
So, so the first thing to Oklahoma City is how much, like,
496.
how long is it?
Let's see, it's 60 miles per hour. So 500? Yeah, something like that. Yes.
Okay, folks, we have about 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes.
And
Some people have already solved this.
To Oklahoma City.
Albuquerque, I guess that would be the same.
Yeah.
And then Albuquerque, that was nice to do.
Yeah, so 3 days. Close, yes. Yeah, I have a friend who just went from Boston to San Francisco driving, and she said it took about a week. So.
We did, I've done Albuquerque to Los Angeles, but then we went to Vegas and we...
Oh, right. So it's not comparable. Right.
So either we take turns driving or we do
We
it
have
overnight in
one
Albuquerque.
We need to do that. People can sleep in the
interstate.
Yeah. We have enough space to sleep in the car.
It's 44 to Oklahoma City and then 40 to Albuquerque.
We'll assume it's a nice day.
So that's 1,040, so that's roughly like 500 more or less. And then we can do, how far is that? Yeah,
Oh, right.
so that's also another 800 miles, so that would be the longer journey.
Yeah, 800 miles. So that's more like a 12-hour day.
Bathroom
But yeah, or
breaks,
you
gas
can
breaks.
lengthen it, whatever. Well, I guess.
Also depends how long you're driving.
We did that match, right?
If you have a cheaper driver, then you can actually shoot that
Yes,
drivers.
during the night.
Depends how
He drives really well.
I don't know what the speed limit is in those.
It's mostly, I think he doesn't go higher than 70. 75, that's the maximum.
Roughly.
75 miles per hour.
Depending on where it is.
Come on in, folks. Come on in. Okay, so how are you guys doing? Is everyone done? Do you need one more minute? No, so what I have is people at the moment, so this
Basically, it's going to be 44, and the news is
Okay, you guys done?
So,
Are you guys done?
there are a lot of highways.
You guys done? Okay. So folks,
And 40 just ends anyway.
8 a.m. on Thursday.
okay, so let's say, in the interest of time, because usually we have 80 minutes and we only have 60 minutes today, and I promise you that when you hear Lant speaking, you'd like Lant to be speaking for 60 minutes. Let's see where you guys are. You guys are done, Lydia? Can you tell me what your route is?
Sure. We're gonna start in St. Louis and go to Oklahoma
So
City.
you're going to go south, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're going to Oklahoma?
Oklahoma City.
Yes.
And that's roughly 500 miles.
Okay.
We're assuming that will take us about 10 hours.
It's a really nice word, assume. Okay.
Right? And from Oklahoma City, we're going to drive to Albuquerque.
You're going to go down to Albuquerque. Okay.
And that'll be another 10 hours plus.
So that's going to be about another 10 hours plus, okay, is by assumption.
By the way, we're sharing the driving duties, so 2 are sleeping while 1 is driving.
Very good. So your team is doing kind of very specific things, right?
Right.
Sleeping and driving.
Right.
Is there going to be any eating?
Drive-through.
Well, drive-throughs,
Okay.
gassing up and doing bio breaks all at the same time
Okay. So let's say, yes, there are going to be toilets.
at the gas stations.
So let's take this word and let's say we assume that there's going to be a drive-through, there's going to be a gas station, there's going to be toilets, right?
Right.
Why do you assume that?
Based on past experience.
Well, tell me what past experience.
Driving in the United States on interstates.
Very interesting.
Highways.
Driving in the United States on interstates and using maps and recognizing that those maps are generally reliable, right?
Generally.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so Albuquerque too?
Then we're going to book it all the way to LA from out.
You guys aren't going to get stuck in Las Vegas.
Hopefully not.
Okay, very good. Okay, so you should be there maybe in 3 days, maybe
About
3.5
40
days?
hours is what we calculated.
Okay, that's about right.
We have a similar path, but we made a list of assumptions, is that we would travel at non-peak travel times so that we avoid traffic.
Okay.
Really get a handle on speed limits on the highways that we were going to travel.
What do you mean get a handle on the speed limits?
I think that we can travel a lot faster than 50 miles an hour. We assumed 75 because in the
Okay.
south they're much higher.
Very good.
We have 5 travelers, so there will be no stops other than bio breaks.
Okay.
We will pack food.
Pack food.
The time of year actually took us upon a southern route because we thought that weather might be a factor.
Right, so it's similar, so you're not going to go up through Colorado.
One of us will bring an easy pass so we don't have to stop.
Okay. And you're going to assume that the Easy Pass works, right?
Yes.
Okay.
We will have a fuel efficient car with the largest gas tank, so we have minimal stops.
Wow.
And
Wow.
all 5 have valid driver's licenses so that we don't have to stop at all.
Very good. Now, let me ask you a question.
Oh, and cruise control so we don't get a ticket.
Okay, so let's get to that last one. What happens if around here you encounter a police person?
Is it a valid stop?
Doesn't matter. What happens if you encounter a police person? Doesn't matter if it's a valid stop or
Oh,
not.
no, it doesn't really. But, you know, but you can be stopped for any reason, I suppose.
Right? Yes. So what is your assumption then? Is that going to be a problem for you?
Is it going to be a problem? No, if we haven't broken any laws, we're respectful, and hopefully we can get that cleared up in no time.
Right. Okay. What happens if you were in Uganda and you encountered a police person?
Better have some cash.
Yes, I mean, you either stand on your principles of saying I did nothing wrong, or
You're not going to get right. So, but you've got to. Okay, so that's now you're going to let your driver negotiate on your behalf, right? But there's a significant amount of uncertainty as what's going to happen. I mean, if you're in the US, even if you've broken the law and you've been speeding, you kind of know that might be something that's going to cost you 45 minutes. And later on you'll pay the speeding fine. But if you're in Liberia, there's a few things about these assumptions that are problematic. The one is that there are lots of maps in Liberia for roads that don't exist. First thing. Second thing is that, you know, if you do encounter a police person, you have no idea what the rules of that exchange are going to be like and kind of how to manage that. That's why you have a driver, which is interesting, we'll get to in a second. But it's kind of a different situation. Many of the things, so you've done a fantastic job of laying out exactly what you're doing, but all you need is something that you didn't think about to kind of really put you, of course, right at the start. Very good. You guys are awesome. Anyone have a different route? Pretty much that's the route, right? The other one I usually hear of is the one that goes kind of north and you go through Denver and you come this way. It's really interesting. You guys have got this and you could, there's like a best practice route. Right? There's a best practice route. We can do that. It's the shortest route. It kind of maximizes where we want to go to, etc. Now I want you to do a second part of the exercise. And I'm just going to hand these out. I wonder if you could help. Kind of just hand them around for me. This is a little bit different. Not hugely different. Just a little bit different. You now are no longer in 2013, but you are in St. Louis. There is no place called Los Angeles. And what I would like you to do is I would like you, please, what you have is you have an East Coast. Let's think that that's what it looks like. And this is where you are. And I would like you, please, to develop a strategy to get to the West Coast. Very simple, and I'm going to give you 4 minutes. Do it in your group, talk to people in your group. You've got 4 minutes. Let's do this quickly. It's just simple.
You need water, food,
By the way, there's a map on the back if you haven't seen it. Very helpful one.
We know the mountains.
yeah, well, you don't know that.
You might not know that.
You might not know
No, you took this one day. No, it's
Why they
oh, yeah, no, yeah, all right.
You have no idea.
There's no votes, right?
I thought when you went to the next one, you could explain what that is.
Oh, yes. Well, maybe we do want to. Yeah, like a wagon.
You need a huge amount of you need cars, you need clothes that can survive the journey. You don't even know how far you're going. Yes. If you can make one day, like you're going to sports once. You have no chance.
Well,
I think once you get going, once you have to have a how do you verify that it's back as far as that comes? You don't even know how far you're going.
There won't be any.
Everyone's provisions and the laws as long as possible.
Maybe somebody, you know, think of somebody which I guess was related just to 5 years and 3 years.
Long shelf life. You have no idea.
Yeah, because you can need a very
Maybe a software change.
yeah. You need a whole team of like 50 people. But that's what they do in expeditions.
Okay, folks, I'm giving you 1 more minute and you've got to get the West Coast.
You need the right team.
West Coast, 1 more minute.
You need the right tools.
So how do you know that you are not going to
Yeah, that's what navigate you find
You can tell you need water supplies. Yeah, so we need to
Okay. Okay, let's bring us together. Let's ask a couple of questions. Okay, folks. Let's hear how to do this because I know that this was such a simple task that everybody solved it within 3 minutes. Heriberto, tell me, what is your strategy?
As the mission is to go to find the west
Yes.
border, you head straight west.
You just head straight west, okay? Why? Why do you head straight west?
Why not?
Well, because you have a clear problem, right? And your problem is to find the west coast, so it makes no sense to go to the east coast. I mean, you know, so the one thing that you have is a clear problem. We're trying to get to the west coast. That's the problem that we're dealing with, and we have a compass. So there's very, very little that we know, but we do know where the west. We do know which direction to go. So essentially, it's beautiful because we have a clear problem, which tells us kind of where we need to go to.
And then once you hit the sea, then you can map out the rest.
No, that's not true, though. That's not true. I mean, if you were to just walk, okay, and you're walking like this. And then you hit the sea, and then you say, well, you can just map out the rest. But if you've walked over here, I mean, if you only do that, you can't map that out. You're going to stay there. You're not going to go back, right?
Well, if you reach San Diego, California, you will stay there.
Oh, yeah. But it raises an interesting question: is if you're going to go along the way, how are you going to get back? Even if you're successful, you reach the west coast. Lewis and Clark weren't told to go to the west coast, they were told to find a route to the west coast and come back and tell people. So
you need of course to take a map, and you're mapping how you went there and what you find along the way, so you're mapping all your steps. So you can trace them back, of course.
So one of the things that you're going to do is you're going to take steps and you're going to actually map the steps that you take, right?
Absolutely right.
Okay. Very interesting. So this is not something where you have the map, which means that you actually have to create the map. Okay? I can't remember who it was, but either Lewis or Clark was a cartographer. Okay? So you're going to have to take someone along who can do this. You can't just take people who have driver's licenses. Beforehand, all you need to do is have people who have driver's licenses and you knew how to sleep. Now you have to have someone who on the go can take a map. Now here's the other thing is, if you're going to take a map, how long do you think it's going to take for the cartographer to map the journey that you took? Let's say you travel for a day. How long will it take them to map that route? Couple of days. Rule of thumb is maybe kind of 2 or 3 times as long as it took you to do it. So now you're talking about a change in the time. Okay? Because the person has to actually map what you're doing. So it's very interesting. Carry on, Herbert.
Something else is you don't know what you're going to face there.
Yeah.
You need to take a lot of supplies, weapons, recipients to take water, medicines, dried fruit and dried meat, and it's really an expedition.
Yeah, but here's the difficult thing is that you don't have like airplanes to take these things on. So you have to take a lot of stuff, but you only have donkeys and horses, right? So how do you take all that stuff? How do you deal with that thing?
Well, I would imagine, like, in those movies you have a caravan and you have the donkeys.
But so you don't know what you're going to run into, but one of the problems is that as we know now with hindsight is that you're going to run into a few things, and one of them is called the Mississippi River. And a caravan isn't going to go over that very easily. And the other thing is a thing here called the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
But also, if you don't know if you're going to be traveling for 3 years or for 3 days. You don't know. So you can't possibly take all of your supplies with you. So how could you deal with that problem?
Bring weapons.
Well, you're definitely going to have weapons, right? And you're going to have people who can use weapons. So they can't just have driver's licenses. Okay? So weapons are going to be part of it, but how do you take the weapons, the food, all of these things? How do you do that? If you also have to travel fairly light. Sure?
Not just horseback, you can technically go.
Take them on horses, etc., etc. Yeah?
Build a raft.
Or the raft when you can.
Follow a water course, because the heaviest thing is water.
Right?
And so, since the Mississippi is known, I mean, that's the Mississippi
Yeah.
on the left side of the map, so you would go down, but presumably the Missouri is also known because it comes into the Mississippi.
No.
I mean, the fact that if you know the Mississippi, Missouri runs into the Mississippi.
Yeah, but they didn't know that.
No, they knew the river was there, they didn't know where it came from.
That's right, they
knew
didn't
it came
know-
from the west.
That's right, but they had to find it, right? And they had to
Well,
find
they
their way
had to
to it.
follow it, but they didn't know where it went,
Right.
but they knew that it came into the Mississippi,
Right.
because it sort of.
So that was one of the things that they were looking for, is they were looking for, let's get onto water as quickly as
So
possible.
let's stay on water as long as possible, because it's also relatively flat.
Right.
And they'll be likely to have, like animals to catch around it, and
Right.
people possibly around it.
Right, until you hit a waterfall, right?
Yeah.
Which did happen a few times.
But
But
another thing you would want is to try to find someone who maybe has some expertise.
Aha.
Was a missionary, or an Indian guide, or someone who had been hunting out there, or somebody with some, whatever local expertise you could identify to take with you.
Right, so you want to get some locals as you move along, because those locals become translators of what you're going to be facing. They can also be the people who negotiate on your behalf when you come against a hostile, and isn't that what happened?
Yeah.
What was the lady's name? Sacagawea, right? They found Sacagawea, and Sacagawea did a lot of these things for them. So it's a really important thing, is you need to work with the local people, and you need to trust them, and you need to go kind of with what they do. The other thing that they do,
learn the language.
you need to learn the language, or you need to find someone who knows the language. Because it's really hard to know. There's a lot of languages that you need to know to traverse that period of time in 1804. This isn't one language.
But really, the first thing that you need is a mission. And you need to requisition the things. So therefore you need some myth of why you need to go to the West Coast.
Right.
So,
You got a mandate.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we need that first.
So you need to have explicit authorization, and you need that authorization to be based on some story that is valid, right?
Or invalid.
Or invalid, whatever it is. And actually you see this, right? If you look at Thomas Jefferson, they created this issue of the problem, and it had a lot to do with territory, and a lot to do with the fact that there was competition out there, and that we need to get out there and we need to beat the competition. There was also some serious kind of mythical parts to this. They believed that there were like saber-toothed tigers and things out on the West Coast. They really did. If you go back and you read Jefferson, said, we're really hoping that we're going to find out where the dinosaurs actually kind of moved to. But it really worked. So some of the other strategies that they employed, the one thing is that they created base camps. So this issue of managing the supplies is, you go forward, you create a base camp, and you sit there for a little bit, and you let your people do the mapping, but you also send some people back and you replenish your stocks, right? And then you move a little bit further and you create another base camp, and you do exactly the same thing. Some people go back, some people go forward, and you find out, look, we took these things, but we found that actually we needed these other things, so let's send people back, and let's go step by step and create places where we can go back to without too much cost, and that we can kind of engage like this, right? Sometimes you would hit a mountain, you'd say, okay, do we go this way or do we go this way? And what they would do is they'd say, well, what's the right answer to that question? Let's do both, right? Because we don't know which way is going to work. But let's not kind of just go the whole way. So we're going to send a party out that will go there, but then in 10 days' time they come back. And this group comes back in 10 days' time, and what do? They find out that this is not the right way, but this is, so now we all go this way. So there's a lot of iteration, there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of solving the problem that you constructed at the beginning, which is the myth, so that you have the authorization. But it's focusing on kind of, let's move west in this structured way, but it's not the same way as going when you have a roadmap, right? Now notice this, we have the roadmap because of these guys. It's interesting, right? We know how to get there now, partly because these guys got there 200 years ago, and a bunch of other people went there after that, and they established a whole institutional infrastructure that right now we just take for granted. So part of the story that Lant's going to tell us now is, what do you do when you're in a developing country and you're trying to build a government? Do you build the government in the same way that you travel from from St. Louis to Los Angeles in 2013, where you take a roadmap and you just go step by step and you say what you need is a good Ministry of Finance, and you need a good civil service law, and you need a procurement law, and what you need is an administrative regime that looks just like it does in Germany, you know? Or do you say, we don't know what we need because we don't know what a government in Sierra Leone should do? It's much more like going from St. Louis to the West Coast in 1804. And in that case, you don't start off with the roadmap that Germany used. You start off by just going in the direction of creating functionality, and you go step by step, and you address the problems, and you learn the lessons, and you institutionalize the success that you have as you move along. What kind of problem are we facing now, and what strategy do we adopt? So let me leave it with Lant to try and unpick all of the confusion and apply the thinking.
Okay. So I think Matt it's the first time I've seen this exercise in a classroom environment, and it's interesting. Matt left out a key piece of information that would have affected your plans here, which is that I need chalk here. There's lots of boxes. Which is I have a very nice summer home here in the mountains outside of Salt Lake, so that clearly would have affected your path. We'll stop and visit Lant's summer home, which was born out of, I'm Mormon. That's the reason I have a house near Salt Lake. And our religion was born in the logistics of getting precisely from Illinois to Salt Lake City in 1848, which had all of the features of travel into a complete unknown and the need to sort of move forward. So the interesting thing is if you come to the Kennedy School of Government, many people who come here, they get a degree in public policy. And the word policy gets used like in a gazillion ways, right? And a gazillion times. We're all about policy. But oftentimes we don't stop to think, well, what is a policy and what would it take to implement a policy? What does policy implementation mean? And what does a policy actually mean in practice? So a policy, and this is like the way, it's a mapping from facts about the world to actions by an agent, right? What's a fire insurance policy? A fire insurance policy is if your house burns down, fire insurance company pays you some money. Right? So there's some fact about the world that's contingent, could be true, could not be true. You have to assess whether or not what the fact about the world is. And then some agent responsible for implementing the fire insurance policy has to take the appropriate action conditional on having correct. I'm going to get rid of this. Are they recording? What?
You don't need it.
I don't need it.
No, he does.
Nobody's recording? Oh, crap. Sorry. They say I'm recording, so I say, oh crap, that was. So the capacity or the capability of an organization for policy implementation has to mean that you have to be able to induce the agents of your organization to correctly assess what the relevant facts for policy implementation are, and take the action that's appropriately associated with those facts. Geez, I'm moving this further and further.
You want to try this one?
What?
Try mine. Mine worked better.
Is yours still on?
No, it's not. But try mine because it worked better. Yours is fine. You got it back.
Cell phone on? Maybe that's interfering. Cell phone on?
Yeah.
Maybe that's interfering.
It's more just where you're standing, like in that point.
Could be it's me. Matt is doing so well. It's a signal. Get Matt back. Okay, let's hope that works. I wish there was some pedagogical point to that. Oh, we did that to show. Wouldn't that be clever? So to illustrate the problem that faces much of the developing world, I just want to talk about one really particular example, a study that was done in New Delhi, a place where I lived for 3 years. And I wasn't part of the study, but one of our colleagues here was. And what they did is assess kind of how people got driver's licenses in New Delhi and tried to see how that was associated with driving safety. Well, what they found is that people came to they found that the policy for getting a driver's license in New Delhi looks like the policy for getting a driver's license pretty much everywhere in the world. You have to ascertain who you are, so you have to have some proof of identity. You have to prove that you have the characteristics associated with eligibility for a driver's license, like how old are you, can you see, and then you have to prove that you can drive, because we're going to give you a legal authorization to drive. Well, what they found was that after the people got by, the researchers trying to get people to get a driver's license to participate in the study, there was another group of people waiting outside the Driver's License Bureau in New Delhi who made a living helping people get driver's licenses. There was touts. And what they found was that if you hired a tout, there was a 12% chance that you took the legally required driving test before you got your driver's license. If you didn't hire a tout, there was a 94% chance you took the legally required driver's exam, and a 2/3 chance that you failed that exam. So basically, what was the policy? Well, the de jure policy was, all the things that were on the books. What was the de facto policy? Hire a tout, get a license, right? The de facto policy was completely divergent from the de jure policy because the organization lacked the capability to induce its agents to correctly ascertain and act on the relevant states of the world that the policy stated. Now, in that environment, we can imagine policy reform. You can imagine hiring consultants. I mean, it's not a pretty picture, but you can imagine yourself doing it. And those consultants go and they find that many of the accidents in New Delhi are the result of people improperly turning left across traffic. And then you would say, oh, well, we need to fix that problem. We need to have people better trained about how to turn left. So let's add that to the driver's examination. We'll force people to understand how to turn left across traffic by adding that to the driver's examination. Well, what's going to be the impact of that? Zero. Because it's not that the policy isn't a desirable policy, it wouldn't achieve its effect if it were correctly implemented. It's the capability to implement it is completely missing. Right? So this is actually a hugely generic problem in the developing world, that basic functions of government about which there is absolutely no ideological divide. I mean, there is no left-right spectrum about whether the government should give driver's licenses. Right? Everybody agrees the government should give driver's licenses. But even core functions about which there's complete consensus this is a legitimate and important activity for the government to engage just simply are not being carried out because the organizations lack the capability. So, and by the way, this is Harvard Kennedy School practice. As if there's a Kennedy School co-author, it's et al., Kennedy School author, et al. Right? Only the Kennedy School author matters. Otherwise, it's alphabetical. So, some other, research colleagues of ours just tried to test the capabilities of post offices, and they chose the post office for two reasons. One, again, no ideological divide that the post office is something the government kind of does. Every government has a post office. And second, all post offices participate in an international agreement that specifies exactly what the policy is. So they all have exactly the same policy. So you can judge their capability independent of policy because they all participate in an agreement that says, if we get a misaddressed letter from another country, we'll return that letter as a reciprocal agreement with all countries as part of the International Postal Customs Union, or Postal Union, that we will return the letter within 30 days if we receive a misaddressed letter from your country. So what they did is they just sent misaddressed letters to 100 countries around the world, 150 countries around the world, right? And just saw how many of them come back. Kind of as a test of, are they complying with a policy that de facto, de jure, they have all agreed to in exactly the same way. Well, and by the way, my suspicion is if you went around the world there would be lots of things that would be different. But you'd kind of recognize the post office. You might not recognize the food, and you might not recognize the dances, and you might not recognize the clothing, but like a post office would be, oh, there's a post office, right? So they really look the same pretty much everywhere. But 25 of the countries, none of the letters came back. It's just like you sent it into a black hole, right? And, you know, this obviously includes Somalia, right? Obviously, if you mail a letter to Somalia, you hope nothing comes back, right? But, you know, but it also includes, you know, kind of Tanzania, Ghana, Russia, Egypt. You know, countries. Places that have governments. But, you know, at least with respect to this, you know, small, non-ideological core function of government, there's no evidence they had a post office at all. Right now, it might work domestically, but it's not working with respect to this function. And in the lowest, you know, in the bottom half of the countries, by schooling, only 1 in 5 letters came back. So the capability to carry out an extremely simple function in half of the countries in the world is still incredibly low, in spite of the fact that we're like, you know, 50, 60 years into a development agenda in which these governments all wanted to and had as a goal to have a functional post office. There was never any, like, no one at the independence of Kenya didn't say, 60 years from now, let's not have a functional post office. Right? It was part of the plan to have it. Now, one of the things about this is that because of the weakness of the capability for implementation, what has happened is that since the organizations are responsible for declaring what the relevant state of the world is, the map of the world created by the administrative capability that exists is completely false. So the data that exists about what is happening is mostly a complete fiction. Because after all, part of the capability is declaring what the state of the world is. Well, in the country, you know, in Delhi, people who have a driver's license, the government has said they took a test and passed it. That's the fact of the world with respect to the driver's license. And they have authority over the fact. The fact is you have a driver's license. So they have declared that the fact is you passed an exam. So the reality, and the administrative reality, and I wish I had a better, more sophisticated sounding term for reality, but we kind of know what that is. The reality and the administrative reality just diverge. And so if you're looking at the administrative reality in the way that you looked at this map in making your plan, you're completely misled about what the reality is. So again, one of our colleagues, Rohini Pandey, was part with some other et al. In doing a study where they looked, again in India, at the reported pollution emissions of various firms that were required by law to hire third-party auditors to report on their emissions. And the red line is the maximum threshold, right? And so 73% of firms reported, you know, being in this range kind of at or just below the legal threshold. Then what did they do? Then they sent people to actually verify what the emissions really were, and what did they find? Well, kind of there's two things, one of which is not surprising at all, and one of which is really hilarious, right? One, of course, is that lots of firms were polluting much worse than they were selling the government. Like, that's not surprising. That's, you know, man bites dog, right? What's interesting is that there were tons and tons of firms with much better emissions than they said they reported to the government. Why?
Because they weren't
Because it was
actually
like,
measuring.
what?
They weren't actually measuring, they were guessing.
They were guessing. And if you're going to guess, then somebody says, the threshold is 150, where are you? Where are you? I'm 125. Right? Because like if I say I'm at 50, that might attract suspicion.
Right.
If I say I'm at 150, that might attract suspicion. I'm at 125. What was the average? 125. Right? I could have told you the answer to this without looking at the first set of data at all, because I knew kind of what was the incentive. Right? But the point is that we don't even see this. In any regulatory debate about what was possible, the fact that there were lots and firms down here wouldn't be part of the debate. Because this was the map, the only map we had was this map that said, wow, it's really hard to get under 100. Well, no, actually, a lot of firms doing it. So, part of our overall approach is that we now have a conceptually and practically much more difficult problem than we've ever had before. Because not only do we, because what we have now is we have post offices that have been around a long time and don't work. Like, you know, there's a phrase that, like, you can't cross a chasm in 2 jumps. And that's a very helpful phrase, because what happens if you fail on the first jump? Well, then you're at the bottom of the chasm, and at the very least your legs are broken, right? And your second jump strategy isn't the same array of alternatives as your first jump strategy, right? So we're no longer in the world in which we have first jump strategies available to us, right? Whatever we might have thought was the theory that would take us to well-functioning post offices in Kenya, in Nepal, in Afghanistan, we've tried that, and it didn't work, and hence we need a conceptually completely different model of how we get to functional post offices from having dysfunctional post offices than what we might have imagined how to get to a post office from no post office or an incipient post office, right? So, you know, this is a still from the movie 127 Hours where he fell into a chasm and there was a rock was on his arm. And his strategy for survival was to cut his arm off. Now, no one would set as their first best strategy, or their first jump strategy, I'm going to cut my arm off, right? But it was the only viable survival second jump strategy where you were. So what we're looking at is second jump strategies. So now I want to do a little exercise that we can hopefully take about 6 minutes. Because what we want to create before we sort of talk the last little bit about PDIA is a little typology. So I want everybody to take out some writing instrument. And since Matt has given you stuff, you have something to write on, or you might have something of your own to write on. And what I want you to do is I want you to write down some activity, some purpose, something that you would like to get done, or that you're engaged in thinking about getting done. Could be collect property taxes in Colombia, could be educate children in Bangladesh, could be provide microcredit in Nepal, could be just anything that you would like to see done that you're kind of engaged in. So write it down. I can see that you're not writing it down. Oh. Anybody have a writing instrument for this gentleman?
Yep.
Gracias. There you go. Now, once you've written it down, I want you to just turn to the people next to you and just say what it is. And again, this is to prevent you from bluffing that you've written something down. So I'm going to engage your neighbor and sort of like, did you really write something down? So turn to your neighbor and just say, just take a few minutes, turn to your neighbor and say, I'm interested in this is what I'm Okay, so what we're going to do is like we're going to take your activity and we're going to make a little analytical typology, right? So on the paper where you've written it down, I want you to make a little table and create 4 rows. Okay? So let's start just with kind of why do we have a typology? Well, we have a typology because we believe that how you approach problems depends very much on the analytical nature of the problem, which isn't revealed by obvious characteristics. So which of these 4 animals, which 2 of these 4 animals are most alike?
Top 2.
Top 2. Okay, why are the top 2 alike? They look alike. They got long pointy ears. They kind of, they look like they live in the same natural environment, right? Any other?
The left two.
What?
The leftmost two.
These 2. Now that seems a crazy answer. How can that little silly bottle of fluff be like this impressive looking creature?
They both look like domestic pets.
They're both pets. Moreover, if you were a biologist, these are the same species, believe it or not. Right? It's amazing what breeding can do, right? But at least in principle, these 2 things could interbreed. So by a biological classification, these are the same species. Any other possibilities?
2 on the right, 2.
2 on that. Why are these the most alike?
Of the wild.
What?
Of the wild.
They're both wild. They both kind of play the same role in their ecosystem. They're top of the chain food predators, right? They have similar diets, live in similar places. So if we were talking about predators, these 2 would be alike. These 2 are both alike in lots of ways. This one having been domesticated to not eat you as much as that one would, probably. And these 2 are alike in terms of a biological classification. I wish I could come up in some way. These 2 are alike? But
Yes.
Well,
They're both in my granddaughter's house.
that's a Borges encyclopedia classification, right? They're both in my daughter's house. There you go.
No, they're both teddy bears.
That's true. That's true. They would both be. They would both. You could both make them into stuffed animals. Okay. So here are the questions I want you to ask yourself about your activity. The first question is: think of the organizational capability that it takes to accomplish your activity, and ask yourself: is that activity transaction intensive? And what I mean by that is does it take few agents or many agents? So just write down kind of yes, no, transaction intensive. Few agents, many agents. And by few we mean, dozens to hundreds. By many we mean thousands to millions. Okay? Second question I want to ask about your activity is, does the successful attainment of the objective of your activity require the agents responsible for implementation to exercise local discretion? And by local discretion, I just mean, do they make decisions that they have discretionary power over? So, paradigm examples, it's like, vaccinations. You need lots of people to give vaccinations, but they don't actually exercise much discretion. Grab a short bean, stick it with a needle. That's the algorithm. It's pretty simple. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but it's pretty simple. Ambulatory curative care, each patient presents with some complicated thing. They're a patient, and they say, me duele el hígado, or they say something, and you have to respond to what they say in ways that lead to a treatment, right?
So what if it can be both?
No, these are mutually exclusive.
But teachers in a developing country, you could have a system where they have quite a lot of local discretion, or ones where they have to teach a curriculum that handed down to them from the top, and they kind of robots.
I disagree, but you can imagine different ways of doing it, but mostly, you actually can't create a system in which teachers don't have local discretion. I mean, they're in the classroom by themselves. They de facto have local discretion, right? So, yes, no. Third question is what you're doing regarded as a service to the client, or is it an imposition of obligations? So, kind of prototypically, are you doing school where the kid wants it, or are you doing jail where the people there don't, right? Are we giving you a subsidy where you want it, or are we collecting a tax where you don't, right? So is your agent in the course of his day doing things to people that want it, or is he in the course of his day doing things to people who mostly don't want it? Right? And then finally, ask yourself the question, does the successful accomplishment of your objective, is it based on a known technology? Meaning, can you look it up in a handbook? Can you look the right answer up? Or does the right answer itself not just require local discretion of the type that could be informed by knowledge from a handbook, but actually require some amount of really innovative activity on this farm, right? So we believe that with these 4 questions answered about your activity, you can think about the implementation capability you require. So there's 5 kinds of things that sort of have to happen in the world. One is policy making, which is typically not transaction intensive, doesn't actually require lots of people. You can make policy with a few people sitting around a room. It does require discretion. It's kind of can or cannot be based on a known technology, and it can concern either of these 2 things. This is one thing that gets done in the world. It's not implementation intensive. The second kind of thing is logistics, which is I may be interested in an activity that's transaction intensive. I need lots of agents to do what I want them to do, but it really doesn't require much local discretion. That is, I can more or less reduce to a script what I want them to do, and that script can be based on a known technology. So, vaccinations. I can roll out vaccinations that requires lots of people to go to lots of places to have a face-to-face interaction, but it's pretty much a script, and it's pretty much based on a science that the vaccination is intensive, and this can either apply to services or obligations. Now, that's not so. Lots of countries in the world have been capable of achieving the logistical component of development. Now, lots of them still have problems even with this, as we saw with the post office example, but lots of things that just require this. Countries in the Sahel have 85% vaccination rates. Complete basket case countries can do vaccinations. So if you can reduce it to logistics, your capability requirements can be self-contained, and you can kind of get those things done. Now, there's implementation-intensive service delivery. It's transaction-intensive, requires local discretion, based on a known technology, and it's a service. This is now implementation-intensive, because the capability of your organization has to be such that you can have agents with the capacity to do what they need to do, who exercise their local discretion, lots of them doing it in a way that produces a valuable service. This is hard. This is really hard. And teachers is a paradigm example, right? Building schools, logistics. Getting textbooks into schools, logistics. Getting chalk into schools, logistics. Getting teachers to day in, day out do the right thing, tough. Really tough, right? Even tougher in some ways is implementation-intensive imposition of obligations, right? I want to collect property taxes. Really? Okay. You've got to have somebody go out and tell somebody who doesn't want their property worth a lot of money for the purposes of taxes, they've got to impose that their property is worth a lot of taxes and they're going to pay. This is tough. This is really tough. And then there's what we call the wicked hard. And since we live in Boston, we have to say it that way. Wicked hard. And wicked doesn't mean evil, it just means very, and hard just loses its R. Wicked hard. Which is, you need lots of people doing things, exercising the discretion, and we don't actually have a known technology. So microcredit is implementation-intensive service delivery. Promoting entrepreneurship. Eek. Promoting entrepreneurship. Where do I look up in the handbook of how to promote entrepreneurship? I don't know, right? It's hard. So, this table, and I'm running just a few minutes over, so I'm exercising a bit of local discretion of the fact that. So. What?
You gotta let us take a photo, unless you're gonna give us the slides.
No. Okay.
There'll be,
No, no, what?
What?
there's a video that we have on our blog site that will have this slide that you can take a look at.
Yes, so we have a,
Awesome.
we're modern-ish. No, we're quite modern. We have a blog site, and on our blog site we have little videos, and in the little videos we walk through and culminates in this table, which is also downloadable
Yeah, yeah.
as a presentation. So you can get this somewhere. And what we think is this helps you think about the difference between what's going to drive action, how we plan for action, how we think about learning and feedback loops, and how we plan on scaling up our endeavor. And as Matt illustrated, driving from St. Louis to Los Angeles in 2010 is an exercise in logistics. Right? Might take multiple drivers, might take lots of gas stations, might take some things that you would have to plan, but it's logistics. So you have an available best practice solution. You can have lots of advanced planning and the implementers just follow the script. You know, you were scripting out exactly how the trip was going to grow with very little uncertainty about what would happen, say, if a policeman stopped you. If we want to evaluate whether it was a good trip or not, we can kind of do before, after, did you get there kind of things. And implementers basically do what they're told.
So,
You know, you can hire a driver and all the driver has to do is stay on, stay on
40.
I-40.
how do you account then for vaccinators being shot in the head in Pakistan and Nigeria if it's just logistics?
But yes,
It's just not that big a deal.
It is to them.
No, it's people get shot in the head, but I'm saying globally, like really most places in the world have done vaccinations. So yes, there are pockets of the world like northwest Pakistan, pockets of the world like northern Nigeria, but the problem is again, if you want to worry about those problems, that's another whole. I have a whole other set of slides, right? But the thing, what?
Well, so I lead global vaccine public policy for Merck, so
Yeah.
it is a big deal, and it's not just logistics.
No, it is just logistics because countries in the world have been able to do it everywhere.
Not for all vaccines.
Yeah.
Not for all vaccines.
The baby vaccines are one thing. Adolescent and adult vaccines are quite another story.
Okay, but then we're talking about different problems because the thing about the world is that the world's been massively successful in vaccinations.
In some places.
Nearly everywhere. If you look nearly everywhere in the world, the sort of they set out to have the expanded program of things, and if you look, the point is that you have to point to Nigeria or Pakistan to point to places where it isn't happening, or there's even trouble making it happen, where there's places like the world that you would think of as otherwise being dysfunctional where it is happening. Whereas for lots of things in the world, right, even in places that aren't Pakistan and northern Nigeria, nothing good is happening, right? And so we're moving to worry about those things. There is a huge amount of worrying about mopping this up in some fragile, really super low. So how I worry about that is that there's an array of capabilities, right? And some places are super low capability, like they lack a state. Somalia lacks a state, right? Northern Nigeria effectively lacks a state. Large parts of Pakistan effectively lack a state, right? There we're worried about one set of problems. But in the rest, in lots of the world that have otherwise apparently well-functioning states, almost none of this is doing because the attempt is to make this, which works well for this problem, work for this problem. We're attempting to take a map of St. Louis to Los Angeles in 2010 and make it work for Lewis and Clark. And we're now in a second jump world where we need a completely different strategy, and the strategy, as Matt has described, is problem-driven iterative adaptation, where we focus more on local solutions for local problems, and by local problems, what we precisely mean is that we allow the problem to emerge rather than assuming that the problem is the lack of the solution. The way a lot of action is motivated is you lack the solution and therefore we'll give you the solution and you'll do it, and that will be the way in which we do it. It just doesn't work for the more sophisticated problems. You push problem-driven positive deviance, which is you create an authorizing environment in which you're authorized to set off and do something new, right? I mean, you were making the point that before you could even wander into this territory, you had to launch the expedition, which meant you had to have an authorization to get the resources, to get the then how you're going to do it is you're going to try, learn, iterate, adapt, right? And then you're going to scale the learning through diffusion.
Can you just go through two? I don't understand the words that you're saying.
Really?
Pushing problem-driven positive deviance?
Deviance.
Deviance?
Yeah.
There's a reason why you chose that so...
Absolutely.
Dan, can I give an example?
Sure.
So I'll give an example that actually connects to the discussion about immunizations. So immunizations have worked for polio, worked everywhere, right?
Generally?
Well, the answer is no. I mean, the answer is no. The answer is that they work everywhere except for places where right now we have a significant problem with them. Okay? I'm not going to do this. We don't have time. They don't work in where?
Nigeria.
Pakistan, northern Nigeria, more than Nigeria, and Afghanistan.
Yep.
Somalia. What are we saying about these places?
Muslim extremists.
These are places where this isn't a logistical problem, right? These are places where the problem looks like this. Okay? The problem is we don't know how to get people into these places to do the immunization. We know how to immunize people for polio. Jab the kid in the butt, mouth opens, 3 drops, whatever. I mean, that's what I've been told, right? Same thing. You have to have the same amount of coverage. If there's a technical problem, it looks like that, right? But if the problem in these places is we don't know how to get the immunizers into the country, and the problem is we don't know how to build the political credibility, and the problem is that there's people with guns who don't let our people go there and they shoot them through the head, here's the issue. If we're going to try and solve that problem with that, we're not addressing the problem, right? And I think that this is one of the issues, is that the issue that we're dealing with in those places is that we're here. So the first way you deal with immunizing kids for polio in those places is by saying, we don't go in and do the thing that we did in other places. That's going to come in later, but we have to solve the local problem first and ask, why can't we get them in? Right? Now, if you ask that question and you get an understanding that we're dealing here with a political problem, or with a social or a cultural problem, or however you want to deal with it and identify it, then you have to say, well, how do we build the authorization to address that problem, because we obviously don't have that authorization now. You can't say, I'm the WHO, I know how to do this, just let me do my job, because they aren't letting you do your job. So you have to say, what's the problem that will get me into that place that actually the village elders and the tribal heads will allow me to move in? This has been one of the issues with HIV care in places like we've just mentioned, right? Now, in that case, you want to say, well, the first thing is let's address the local problem and nominate that, because or else we're not solving the thing that matters. Now you say push problem-driven positive deviances. You want to say, they're going to say, well, what are you going to do? Well, let's say we're going to experiment with 5 things and find out which ones work. So we're going to get some authorization. We're going to start small and we're going to find, how do you do this here? Because we don't know how to do this here. The reason why we have a problem in Afghanistan is not because the WHO hasn't tried to vaccinate kids for polio. They have. But nothing's worked yet. So let's try some experiments and find some deviance that works, that we can get some legitimacy and go to people and say, there's a positive deviance here. We actually can do this. We know how to do it. This is what our technology is, because at the moment we don't know what that is. But it's better to get the positive deviance in the place where you're trying to intervene, because that gives you legitimacy in the place you're trying to intervene, than get it from outside. So that's what we mean by that. Then you say, well, try, learn, iterate, and adapt. You say, well, we know that we got some positive deviance, but we're not exactly sure how to pull it off, so we have to try and we have to learn. And we have to work out what works, what doesn't work, and how. And we have to do that in a very experiential and engaged way, so that we can get the lessons as we go along. This isn't something you can do where you have the evaluation coming in 3 years' time. So this is kind of where I think we are. The problem in where we haven't closed the gap with immunizations is because we're treating a complex problem with all of these other dimensions as a logistical problem. And so that's an example of how we would go about thinking of it in this manner. And you're building a different kind of capability, and one where you can actually adapt to your context and deal with something, and maybe even turn this complex problem into something that's more logistical. Sorry,
No, that's brilliant. We're using different words
precisely to disrupt your thinking, right? I mean, there's a reason why we use crazy words, right? If we use words you thought you understood, we might find ourselves in the place that you think you understand what you're saying and we don't. So we'd rather have you misunderstand and know it than misunderstand and not know it, right?
So, well, I don't know if it helps, but two little things I can say is problem-driven should be maybe have a hyphen in it.
Okay.
Okay.
There you go.
So then I
shouldn't
begin,
have a hyphen. It does have a hyphen.
No,
Yeah,
not in number 2.
Yeah, it should have a hyphen.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
You
We should
okay?
bring the hyphen down there. Okay.
Right.
That solves the problem.
Right.
And then there is, to me, there's an issue of deviance
Yeah.
as opposed to outcome. Why choose the word deviance from outcome?
Because we don't know. Meaning,
No, deviance, I have no idea what deviance means.
Positive deviance.
really?
Well, it's about
Yeah.
positive
You're a much more healthier individual than I am. I know immediately what deviance means.
Deviance means change from the norm?
Yeah.
What?
Because that's a known concept
Right.
in sociology,
Exactly.
but not necessarily known in other disciplines.
Exactly. So we could put quotes, or we could put hyphens, we could put quotes.
Yeah, you-
Positive deviance is actually a known, we're not inventing positive deviance, right? Positive deviance is a known concept.
I see.
But the point is, and your misunderstanding is precisely the dominant view of the world that we're pushing against. Because the first jump strategy is that the way to solve a problem is by improving compliance. Right? If we have a bad bureaucracy, the solution to a low capability bad bureaucracy is to increase process compliance. Because we think we know that process compliance will produce the outcome we desire. But if we admit that we don't know that, right, then we don't actually want to enforce process compliance as our exclusive strategy. We want to create an environment where we say, why don't you try something out that we don't know for sure will produce the outcome? Because when you say focus on the outcome, that presumes that I know what my agent should do to produce it, and hence my problem is exclusively agent compliance, right? So let me give one last example, and then we probably should wrap up, right? And by the way, we should emphasize more that we're bringing together kind of sets of issues that are known across large numbers of disciplines to address this particular problem. But for instance, I have a friend who works in Bihar, India, which is one of the lowest capability states of India. And sort of one of the local bureaucrats kind of got engaged with the fact that kids going to the schools in Bihar weren't learning to read. Right? Now, in Bihar, like everywhere else, the schools are a top-down, well, not everywhere else, but in Bihar, there's a top-down bureaucracy that says what the school day should look like and says what the organization of the school should be, which is kids should sit in classrooms that are divided by grades. Right? And grades are roughly divided by age, and you move across the grade from year to year. Okay? So what they noticed is that kids in grade 4 were at all different levels of learning. Some kids in grade 4 literally couldn't recognize the letters. Some kids in grade 4 could read. So what they did is in the afternoon session of the school, they rearranged the school to be grouped by level of learning, not by grade. This is a deviation, right? This is a deviation from the accepted practice. And it's a problem-driven deviation because the problem was acknowledged that at our current organization and operation of the school, we're not achieving the objective of having kids read. So let's allow, and this sort of bureaucrat had enough power to allow schools to undertake the positive deviation of regrouping by learning by level in the afternoon session of the school. So this was problem-driven, right? As opposed to solution-driven. It wasn't more of the same, it was something different. And it was positive deviance, in quotes, which is, this is something that was done that hopefully produces better outcomes. And sure enough, they improved learning levels in these schools just enormously in very short times. In 6 weeks, they had produced a year's worth of learning.
So my problem is with the positive. I know deviances.
Right.
How do you know, without looking at outcomes, how do you know positive?
No, your goal is to promote positive deviance, right?
No,
And you
no.
know what negative deviance looks like.
No.
Yes, you do.
No, we're
Yes, you
trying
do.
different things.
What?
We're trying different things.
Right.
We're trying to break them up into
Exactly.
grades, we're trying to break them up by age, we're trying different things.
Exactly.
How do we know it's a positive?
That's what this step is. We try, learn, iterate, adapt, right?
Because you measure the outcome.
Aha.
Yeah. Use positive because
You
it
need
achieves
outcomes
outcomes.
someplace.
We all say that.
But we have, yeah, of course.
We agree, yes.
Right.
That's going west. Going west from the
Yeah,
back.
we're
Yeah, but of
going
course,
west.
going west was completely wrong. They didn't go west. What did they do? They followed the river.
Okay.
So if you had headed due west, so part of the problem in the world, right, is precisely heading due west. Heading due west was stupid, right? You might have seemed smart, but when you actually look at the local configuration, you realize the river that you had to follow for logistical reasons went northwest. So they went northwest. Matter of fact, they went almost due north for a long time because you had to follow the river, even though you knew you were going west, right? So the point is, if you've nominated problem, you've got a metric of the outcome,
Okay.
right?
Right.
In which case you can push problem-driven positive deviance because you've got a metric of the outcome that you're trying to solve. Whereas with the
Intermediate outcomes.
what?
Intermediate outcomes.
Intermediate outcomes. You have some narrative of what you're trying to do, right? And then obviously you're try, learning, integrating, adapt. And by the way, we know what negative deviance looks like, right? Because that's what we mostly have. Most of the deviance in current organizations are corruption, like attendance rates at schools in Bihar were only 50%. So, we didn't need more negative deviance. We had plenty of negative deviance, right? But you wanted to push problem-driven positive deviation. And you didn't know how, to some extent you knew positive from negative deviance because you're authorizing positive deviance. And then how you know how positive your positive deviance is only comes after you learn. But the point is that if you strictly enforce solution-driven process compliance, which is by and large the dominant strategy of most bureaucracies in the world, you will never know if it was positive or negative deviance because you were never managing outcomes in the first place, right? Okay,
We're way over time.
I'm tempted to keep going because it's fun for me. I hope it's some fun for you, but we probably should break, allow you to move on to the next session. Thank you very much for coming.